Holding it. Okay,
Okay.
David Blacker with What's Left of the World. He's on with us today. And David, welcome back. This is our final conversation just with the two of us, and then we'll schedule a time for you to be grilled by our many patrons.
Okay, sounds good.
All right. So, I wanted to, last time we communicated, you were saying you hoped that we got to the meat of your book in this conversation. And I want to do that. I want to go right to it,
Okay.
if at all possible. And it seems to me that the meat of your book has to do with religion and I would say permaculture. That those two things taken together, and how the left should embrace both, some sort of new religious worldview and an embrace of a permacultural ethic, uh, is at the key. It's like the key to your book. It's one of the reasons why there's this picture of the Earth on your cover,
Right.
right?
Yeah. 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 I'm a
Ty-
favor of the earth. Yeah.
Typical bourgeois nonsense.
Right.
No,
Right.
no,
Well, yeah. Well, yeah. Okay. All
no,
right.
no. I'm
I'll,
not,
I'll
I'm
accept that.
also in favor of the Earth.
Yeah.
I'll
All right.
agree with that.
Sure.
Actually, I'm not being serious, but no,
Well,
but tell me, one thing you said in the book is that religion predates capitalism.
it
It
even
even
predates feudalism.
right, and that we shouldn't expect for religion to go away in a new socialist society. And I guess what I want to know is, when you're talking, like one of the things about Marx's critique of capitalism is that some concepts are transformed under capitalism, or some social forms are transformed under capitalism, so that while they may have existed in the past, they didn't exist in the way that we know them now. Like, for instance, even money has a different character under capitalism than it did in feudal times and earlier.
Sure.
Do you think that there's something transhistorical in a religious sensibility that we're going to hold on to? And do you think religion in a capitalist society has a different character than it did, I don't know, say in the time of cavemen, or in the time of uh,
That's cave. That's
pre?
cave. That's cave persons, Doug. Um, you know.
Okay, in the time of cave persons.
Yeah. Okay. uh, well. Okay. With religion, I mean, I'm kind of accepting your description there as a shorthand. So, but I think and I don't want to come across, certainly for anyone who hasn't read the book, as someone who's just sort of defending traditional biblical religion, because I'm not. I mean, I talk about that, and I specifically really kind of reject that as an option. I think as an option as far as an attractive worldview going forward, though I think you have to have a certain high degree of humility. And so when I'm emphasizing that religion predates capitalism, predates feudalism, et cetera, I'm sort of speaking of the biblical religions. Obviously, their religions are that's a very, very wide referent, and it refers to all kinds of things beyond the biblical religions and other traditions and so on. Um, but as long as we understand it sort of widely there, I think it does. I do think it is larger than capitalism, or really any specific economic system, or certainly any narrowly construed economic ideology. I mean, I think religion, like art and other things, are cultural universals. So I think we find this everywhere. It's part of what it is to be human, at least maybe for the last, what, 100,000 years or so.
Okay, so what would you how would you describe religion in its transhistorical form? Or, I mean, you're going to have to be talking about
Yeah,
an
yeah. Here's what I okay, to be precise about it, the category that I would prefer, though it's not as poetic or rhetorically nice to use, is a phrase from analytic political philosophy, a comprehensive conception of the good. So, in fact, in a previous book, what I wrote before the zero books that I wrote, I even ended up abbreviating that to CCGs. But that's a conception that's a phrase that you find in people like John Rawls, sort of more contemporary analytical political philosophy, where comprehensive conception of the good on the ground in terms of, say, if we're talking about American politics, American history, 99% of the time, you're probably talking about religions in the traditional biblical religion sense. So, but not always. One can have a secular comprehensive conception of the good, of course, that's not rooted in certainly any of the biblical religions, and might even be atheistic. So one could be philosophical, one could be a utilitarian or a Kantian, say, or something like that. But one can also, one's comprehensive conception of the good could also be derived from Islam, Judaism, Christianity, et cetera, and obviously non-biblical, non-Western religious worldviews as well. And so that's sort of that larger category, which I think is reflective of the need for meaning. One of the premises that I work with, that I I'm working from in this book, is that we are in a sense narrative creatures. We strive to make meaning out of our lives and our world, and we need, in a psychological, perhaps existential sense, a sense of purpose, a sense of structure to our lives, a sense of a framework which can order the virtues. That's the way the philosopher Alistair McIntyre would put it. A mechanism for striving for virtue. Virtue just being a notion of what's right, what's wrong, sort of these distinctions, and a mechanism for striving to be a good person. In the realm of education, we need, as I talk about in this book, a framework that justifies a paideia, which I devote some time discussing, which has to do with a regime of education that strives toward a particular comprehensive conception of the good. That is, it has a picture of a particular comprehensive conception of the good, and it uses curriculum, pedagogy, all the sort of mechanisms of education to gear itself toward that. So it's that larger sense of comprehensive conception of the good. Now, in this book here, I argue that there's kind of two aspects to this that are important, and I think the trick is to maintain both of them simultaneously, and it's somewhat easy, I think, to embrace one and ignore the other. And I sort of colloquially describe this as going high and going low in terms of comprehensive conceptions of the good. So going high, I think, involves highly intellectual, cognitive, but perhaps aesthetic understandings of the good. So where we might have, say, in the history of Christianity, we might have someone like Thomas Aquinas or Duns Scotus, or sort of high level philosophical, theological disputations and articulations of Christianity, which may themselves have very, very little to do with the going low part of Christianity, which, and let's think about medieval times for a moment, which have to do with the rhythms of everyday life, with life events, marriages, births, seasonality, harvests, all that stuff that kind of makes up a communal life, that provides a framework for communal life. And so people can strongly feel that they're a Christian and can sort of plug in either at that high level intellectual level of the sort of theological understanding, or they can plug in at the everyday life level, which is not so simply dependent on the sort of high octane philosophical theological disputations.
Well, while you were talking, my daughter came in to say goodbye, but you were a real trooper and just went right through it, and I did catch everything you said.
Just wind me up and watch me go.
Yeah. But what I noted there is that you said something at the start that I was going to take issue with, and I think you almost clarified it as you went along. And what you said at the start that I was going to take issue with is this idea that meaning, or that a notion of the good. What did you call it? The
A comprehensive conception of the good.
Yeah, CCG.
Yeah.
Necessarily would have a narrative form, because if you talk about something like utilitarianism or Kantian ethics, those don't seem to me as to be founded on narratives. They're
well, not narrative
rational.
in the sense of, I don't know, fiction or something, but I think it's a narrative in the sense that it provides an account of certain crucial aspects of human life.
I guess I would, for me, a narrative, one of the things about a narrative is that it is a necessarily emotive, I mean, I guess I may be thinking like a fiction writer, but it's certainly emotive, based on characters and based on and associations and themes, rather than rational, worked out arguments. That if you're looking at a narrative, you're not looking to question the narrative based on strict logic necessarily.
I guess what I mean by narrative is somewhat more encompassing than that. I mean, I would include the kind of narrative that you're talking about, but I would also include narratives that could be derived from more sort of philosophical sources. So, if we take someone like Kant, or if we take the Mills with utilitarianism, I think there's an implicit picture. Let's say, for starters, there's a philosophical anthropology. There's either an implied or explicit picture of what human beings are. Okay, that would be the philosophical anthropology. There's a teleology. There's a telos. There's some conception of human purposes, or kind of when you get into some of the old-fashioned Enlightenment stuff, there's this focus on distinctiveness of the human. I'm not as big on that, but I think that's a hallmark of a comprehensive conception of the good, at least under the aegis of modernity. So you get a sense of final purposes. Why are we here? What are we doing? What happens after we die? These sorts of things. And I think these can be thought of as providing at least the outline or structure for a narrative framework. The narrative being sort of our lives as a whole.
Would you say,
and also our collective lives? Like what's the some account of what's significant about that which has preceded me and that which will follow me after I'm gone.
As an old-fashioned philosopher, I kind of tend to think that if you're working based on a notion that's true, that you are no longer relying on the kind of narratives that are merely asserting values, but that you've discovered them through deployment, maybe the use of reason or empirical research, hopefully a combination of both. And that those things, I would want to distinguish that kind of approach to the philosophical truth or scientific truth from the kind of narrative meaning that arises when you have just a merely coherent set of values that you're holding on to.
Yeah, I mean, well, these are deep questions, but that are tough to get a purchase on. But I wouldn't accept the divide that puts philosophers, particularly in the area of moral, social, political philosophy, on the divide of a kind of pure empiricism, where we're just sort of investigating the way the world is, and we're just investigating the truth of the world, and that's somehow different from the narrative structure. I think you can't do without narrative structure, narrative scaffolding in philosophy.
Okay, well, sure, but like one difference might be the difference between a narrative that is understood and that people value, but that doesn't have any purchase in the material relations of the world. So, for instance, today I would think that most religious narratives are no longer really primarily operative in the world, that they are that the relationship that most people have to religious belief is similar to their relationship to other media or ideological constructs.
It's like
they're all fans. They're basically
consumption, sort of like
yeah.
something you do on a for a few hours a week, or you watch it on TV even, or some people experience it as a bill they get in the mail. They're supposed to pay their dues, literally to the
Right.
church or synagogue or whatever it is. So it sort of becomes. I had that experience too with once upon a time, sort of getting the bills way back when people used to get bills in the mail. Where you have we'd have. I realized when we'd have the electric bill, the gas bill, the the mortgage, and then here's the bill, the religion bill, that had to be paid.
Right.
And it sort of looked like, okay, I can do without this bill. I can take that one off the table and not have to worry about it. But yeah, sure. I mean, because that's the society we're living in, where everything we do is inframed by this logic of capital, neoliberalism, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, I mean, but I really don't want to give the game of meaning to biblical religions. I mean, I think they're the primary players for millennia, but I don't think they are the future necessarily. Though you can never count them out. They're pretty resilient.
Well, I would say, like, in our society, that the Joker is flashing through my head. We live in a society, but in our society, we have a conception of the good, and that conception is abstract, and it's what is good is what expands the realm of labor. That basically the increasing labor time is good, producing more value is what's good, and anything that works against that is the bad. That's sort of the ideology.
Maybe, I guess some people think that. I don't think everybody thinks that, though.
Well, the nice thing about this narrative is you don't have to think it.
Right. It's like, it's what is that joke that Zizek tells all the time about the
canned laughter? It laughs for you.
Well, there's that too, but there's the
Niels Bohr. It works even if you don't believe in it.
Yeah, it works if you don't believe it. So it doesn't matter. It just keeps going. Yeah. Sure, right. There's a certain amount of that, but I think that on the whole, though, I think that the skepticism of modernity has sort of reached a point where, and if you take much stock in survey research and so on, the survey research does seem to suggest, at least in the more economically developed countries, the survey research seems to suggest that religious belief in that old-timey biblical sense is decreasing by generation after generation. So, the rising generation now has less belief in that sense than our generation, and then we have less than the generation before. So, I think the traditional biblical religious narratives are subject to a corrosive skepticism that makes them just hard to believe. They're sort of like fairy tales. The biggest liability with biblical literalism, from my point of view, is that it's false. These are false belief systems that are based on miracles and a lot of implausible stories from biblical sources and so on and so forth. And that's so I think those particular narratives, those particular types of religious narratives, are being rendered less and less effective.
There's an old Rick, you remember Rick Roderick?
Yeah.
There's an old Rick Roderick lecture where he asked the question, what is the more persuasive and meaningful myth that we might find today in society? Is it the old Christian myth of sacrifice and redemption and right. God, or is it this myth where the world was created out of nothing, spontaneously, and for no rational reason and no particularly set way? It expanded, the world and universe expanded, and eventually it will drift into nothingness, and that everything that you know now will disappear, and in the end it will all have signified nothing at all. He put it better than that.
Right, that's a pretty austere narrative, that one. Yeah.
That's one that I think a lot of people believe, though.
Sure.
And it may be that your your desire for us to develop a meaning and a concept of the good on the left, a universal concept of the good, is a way of to fight against that sort of uh, Carl Sagan on depressants, uh, myth about the cosmos and our place in it.
Absolutely. I mean, if we want to throw labels around, I'm a Nietzschean, and for sure, in the sense that I see my opponent is nihilism. I see nihilism as the number one problem. That's the grave threat. That's the darkness. Is that of nihilism.
Right. And you feel as though the source of nihilism today, or I mean, maybe the what will overcome nihilism is creating a meaning rather than creating rather than getting rid of something in society, or replacing
exactly. Because I think the negative critique, we're in certainly on the left, we're in a sort of destruction mode. You know, we're like I say in the book, I think we've at the high level, at the high end, I think we've reached. Let me put it this way: at the high end, corresponding to the medieval Christianity, the cathedral, you might say, at the high end. Oh, I might get canceled by saying that, but
that's all right. That's okay,
yeah.
Nick.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Well, at the high end, I think you could make the case that we and I'm guilty of this along with everyone else, but I think it was perhaps a necessary phase. But at the intellectualizing high end, we've perhaps reached peak critique of neoliberalism. Do we need yet another book decrying neoliberalism and the depredations of neoliberalism? And all that's great. It's good to have the right critique, and good work has been done, and it was good to get all that clarified. But it's sort of like shooting fish in a barrel at this point, intellectually. I mean, it's so, and also by the same token, I would say at the low end, the critical energies have been channeled into something akin to identity politics, which, in my point of view, there was excitement and a lot of energy, sort of extending the egalitarian drive and inclusiveness into those areas. But I think they ultimately provide cul-de-sacs, dead ends. And I mean that in a very specific way. That is, they create new hierarchies. They become little mini kingdoms of hierarchies because they're based on a notion of authenticity or proximity to, what is pure in terms of the identity. So they end up instituting little hierarchies, which and everyone's place in those little hierarchies, those little tyrannies even, is defined by one's place, how one's level of authenticity vis-a-vis the identity in question. And so both at the high at the high level and at the low level, I think we've reached these sort of critical dead ends where all we're doing is critiquing and complaining, and we're not providing anything constructive, to put it simply. And I think the real risk, I don't think it's brave or risky at this point to provide yet another litany of complaints and critiques. I think what's actually brave and risky, and what's really upsets people, and what really causes some disruption potentially, is to actually do the hard and embarrassing, maybe self-revealing, vulnerability making work of trying to project some kind of positive vision, to try to build something rather than just deconstruct, critique, complain, etc., etc.
Yeah. So
stop complaining. But I think that's. But I think I'm not. I'm
look, but I've got an infected finger right now. Look at that. No, I just wanted to complain about something. No, I wasn't about to complain.
But I think that's the Marxist tradition too. And I know people are really annoyed by saying this. We're long on critique, short on positive solutions to anything. And I know that's really annoying. In fact, the last book, to me, one of the most annoying criticisms of the falling rate of learning that I wrote before this book was that I would routinely get, because the people who were most upset at me were activists who were saying, this is too pessimistic. The critique is so all encompassing that you've left us nothing to do. And I said, well, yeah, maybe there's nothing you can do. I sort of perpetrated what Frederick Jameson called the loser logic, and he referenced Foucault with this, where the theorist wins insofar as he or she builds this sort of comprehensive picture of domination and power and so on and so forth, again referencing Foucault, but thereby you also lose because the extent to which you win theoretically, that is, you construct the airtight system that sort of explains anything, there you also lose from an activist point of view or from a point of view of changing the world, because any notion of efficacy, free will, etc., seems to drop out of the picture. And the cage that you've created is so comprehensive that there's nothing that can be done. So it actually is bound to create something so enclosed. I think it's bound to critique developed to a certain point is bound to take us in that direction. And I kept hearing that complaint over and over again, and I tried to explain from my sort of high level philosophy mode that, well, it's stoicism and pessimism doesn't necessarily mean quietism and so on and so forth. But I tried to take a step back and realize that my very annoyance to this my very annoyance at this criticism perhaps provides some clues. And instead of running from it, maybe I ought to just go right into it and try to take up the challenge and see what happens. And I think there's something liberating in a way to feel like you're at least trying to suggest something. Now, I fully expect that the worldview that I project as, and I try to make a case that it's superior to what I see as the main competitors on offer. And I fully realize it's incomplete, it's suggestive, it's perspective, and so on and so forth. But I guess I'd really rather have that conversation than yet more critique, which at best implies some normative framework from which the critique is coming, but it doesn't make it explicit enough, doesn't give all of the rest of us enough, I think, moral, psychological motivation or energy to persevere in the face of some of the difficulties that we're facing.
Well, it seems to me that the history of Marxism is not as negative as just emphasizing critique as you might think it, or as you're saying. It certainly is the case that from the Frankfurt School on, that the realm of critical theory has taken that approach.
Well,
that's where Marxism.
I agree with you on that. If you're talking about the whole history of Marxism.
Yeah, but I mean,
but
the positive project of the positive project of Marxism has been in the 20th century the development of the Marxist Party and involvement in the party.
Yeah, and that's all true. But my point is that you have to go back a pretty long way to get that. You have to go back to communism. You have to go, which I think counts as a comprehensive conception of the good. Communism hit the high and the low that I'm talking about both. There was a Soviet communism. There was a picture. It might end up being an abhorrent picture for many people, but it was a picture. Whenever I talk about this, it reminds me of that scene, and maybe you could clip this in at some point.
Okay.
That scene in Big Lebowski when they're at the diner.
It says say what you like about the Nazis.
About National Socialism. At least it had an ethos.
That's right.
They're nihilists, Donnie.
Right. Yeah. Right. Okay. So I would say that the question of how to become political today, if you're a Marxist, and the question of how to develop a Marxist meaning for the world, maybe not that different. Maybe it's the same question as to how to develop a politics for transformation and how to create a worldview and a meaning are maybe not that set apart. And would you say that's the case for you, that your vision of developing a meaningful politics is primarily a way to become political, to seek power?
Well, yeah, I mean, maybe, well, with the caveat. I mean, I suppose I should probably back up, because answering that question fully requires maybe backing up a little bit.
Okay.
So in the chapter called Moral Motivation and Worldview, I think is where I try to make the argument that, we can talk till the cows come home about worldviews, or worldviews of various kinds. There are worldviews that are inimical to any kind of leftist or progressive sensibility, of course. There are worldviews that don't seem to have much political content to them at all. Actually, there are worldviews of almost any of an infinite variety. So, for me, though, and what I assert and defend in this book is that to boil it down, it's actually not as complicated, perhaps, as it might seem. But what's definitive of the left, I think, what makes a worldview consonant with any kind of recognizably left-wing politics is a commitment to equality. There's an egalitarian impulse, I think, that defines the left-wing project broadly. And so I mean super broadly. So is there anything at all that defines even the liberals, sort of barely on the left, with the far left? And I think it's different shades and intensities and venues in which the impulse toward egalitarianism is defended in various respects. So my argument is that, what makes sense. So the civil rights struggle, for example, being a marquee example of a sort of left and liberal, specifically probably liberal led for the most part, impulse, which interestingly enough was, I think, probably the last time the broad left had a fairly widely shared, powerfully motivating worldview at the back of its politics. And then I mean, say a figure like Martin Luther King and others in the African American church, which premised a lot of that civil rights activity. Now, of course, you could sign on to civil rights in the 50s and 60s without embracing that particular strand of Christianity or biblical religion, of course. But that was certainly a motivating force that did a lot of this work of meaning that I'm gesturing toward. But I think that that's probably the last time that there was something that was powerful and somewhat widely shared that motivated any kind of left liberal project. So, but anyway, my argument in that moral motivation chapter is I argue for what I call, and forgive this sounds sort of high tech and fancy, I suppose, but a Nietzschean extrapolation. Nietzsche gives this kind of inverted narrative where socialism and, democracy and then socialism for him are this regrettable fruit of Christianity, essentially, sort of the Judeo-Christian ressentiment or revaluation or reversal of values, where something like the Sermon on the Mount is a leitmotif, where the meek shall inherit the earth. This reversal of values, where the lambs try to get the lions to believe that there's something wrong with being a lion, and so on and so forth. And Nietzsche sees the Christian notion of the soul as the premise. There's a kind of egalitarianism in Christianity that's quite radical, if you place it in its own context of development, where we all have souls, and those souls are distinct from all the determinations that make us who we are in other respects. So beneath our wealth, our social status, even our gender, all these determinations, all our physical situation in our body, there's this soul that's underneath all that. And we will all be judged equally. This is ideally, in the ideal sense, in Christianity, we'll all be judged. And so there's kind of a radical egalitarianism at the soul level. And so for Nietzsche, it's almost inevitable that this develops into a championing of democracy. And then ultimately, going even further and extending democracy into the economic realm, we have socialism and so on and so forth. So now Nietzsche thinks this is a regrettable development, right? I don't go with those people who whitewash Nietzsche. There's a whole cottage industry of scholarship that washes Nietzsche and kind of tries to make him into this delightful bourgeois, character. And I think Nietzsche's a lot more edgy and scary than that. But Nietzsche thinks that definitely thinks that that's a regrettable development. He calls socialism, democracy and socialism for him are, quote, the tyranny of the least and the dumbest. It's fairly unambiguous what he thinks of these developments. And but I think that Nietzsche is actually mistaken in placing this sort of meta valuation on this large scale development of of expansion of egalitarian notions and so on. I don't think there's any philosophical warrant for regretting that development. There may be tenuous philosophical basis for lauding it also, but I choose to laud it, and I think that's what's definitive of the left. Is I think that there's some sort of we have a sense of approbation for the egalitarian momentum and extending it further and further into various realms, and even into the realm of identity, which is another topic which I think leads us astray in certain respects. But anyway, so what I argue is that what I'm calling this Nietzschean extrapolation is that reverse the valuation. Nietzsche is the great philosopher of revaluation, or explaining how the revaluation of values took place in the genealogy of morality. But I think we should actually reevaluate Nietzsche as well and turn Nietzsche on his head in certain respects. And to me, that is sort of consonant with or harmonious with what any recognizable progressive or left project that I can imagine. But the extrapolation comes in my point of view, and this is what I explained in that chapter, is that I think the egalitarian impulses need somewhere to go. Now, do they go into these various identity projects? No, I think that's a trap. And I agree with Mark Fisher of Zero fame, where he characterizes this trap of identity politics as a vampire castle. Now, we can talk more about that. But I think that's a trap. I think it's a very, very sophisticated, difficult trap. And I think it's one that the left has pretty much fallen into almost completely. But I think there's another direction that can be taken. The egalitarian impulse does not have to be derailed and channeled into the self-defeating ambush of identity politics, in my point of view. It can also be extrapolated in a different direction, which I think is a direction which is more expansive in terms of the notion of species. And in this sense, I think it's important to actually go beyond 19th century Marxist morality, where Marx, the early Marx, the humanist Marx, speaks a lot about a species being, and that's what we need to strive for, and a kind of moral universalism referencing only humans. But I note it several times, and with several thinkers, not just Marx, but also just straight liberal thinkers like John Dewey and so on. But this is one thing that unites someone like Marx and Dewey, if you want to cover the spectrum of liberal to far left, is this commitment to species being or humanism. It's anthropocentric. It's a highly anthropocentric notion. And I think we're at the point now where we're starting to be able to glimpse the limitations of an anthropocentric morality, where we are unable to, first of all, really factor in future generations of even humans. So anthropocentrism having to do with existing humans at the moment. We're unable to accommodate notions of animal rights, say, comfortably within our legal and moral and philosophical frameworks on the left. We're unable to accommodate notions of the intrinsic value of the earth in certain environmental and more radical environmental conceptions. And so what I think is in the best spirit of the left is to continue the egalitarian, invert Nietzsche, don't regret the Christianity, democracy, socialism progression, invert Nietzsche, don't regret it, celebrate it, but actually extend it not into the dead end of identity politics, but extend it in this more environmental and I argue more Gaian, etc. direction that tries to conceive of a non-anthropocentric worldview as the real legacy of leftism, you might say. Now, I know this is a huge mouthful. I should probably stop now so you can tell me why I'm completely wrong.
Well, you're definitely not on the same page with me exactly, but I just want to poke at it a little bit.
I may not be on the same page with anyone. So
that would be good.
Right.
Well, here's what I want to ask you is, do you feel as though when it comes to recognizing the equality of life, that's what I'm assuming you're talking about here, is that all living beings should be taken as equally valuable. Is that
Yeah,
am I right?
something like that. Although what we mean by equally valuable is kind of fraught. But let's start. Can we start with baby steps and just say there is value there?
Sure, but when you're talking about equality, in today's society, you're talking about equality before the law. Maybe there's equality in terms of a set of rights that everyone should have
That's right,
access to.
and I think those developments are along the lines that I'm thinking. So, and in fact, I talk about this in the book. So if we're talking the legal framework, so for example, well, there's animal rights. In our system of law, the only way let's just take animals for example, or the earth. We could take kind of all of them. The only way non-humans can show up is as property. Right, that's the only way they can really show up. So animal cruelty is kind of a abuse of somebody's property, basically. Or environmental devastation has to do with essentially property rights. Someone's property rights are being mistreated. So like some human is suffering because of resource extraction or an oil spill off of a pipeline or something like that. It always comes back to that. And I think there are some interesting developments that show a different possible conception, even within that super anthropocentric legal realm. So in Spain.
Is that the case? Because if I purchase a cat and that cat's my property, and then I tortured the cat to death, I can be charged with animal cruelty. Can't I?
Yeah, you can. Yeah. And so
that's not a matter of property. It's not a matter of violating someone else's property rights.
That's a good point to make, because we've started to, there's like a little bit of a tag end of that starting to enter in, but that's pretty new.
Yeah, but what's the basis of that? What's the legal basis of that charge of animal cruelty? It must be the recognition of sentience. Like, I couldn't be charged with animal cruelty for torturing a pigeon to death.
Yeah, there's like a phylogenetic line that gets crossed. Mammals,
or like a hermit crab. I couldn't get charged with torturing a hermit crab to death. I want to know the list so I can do some torturing.
Yeah, well, you gotta make sure to keep yourself just on the side of the phylogenetic ladder.
Right.
Want to be. But so for example, there's and there are compromise situations too. Like, so probably right on the borderline would be something like chickens, where if you really want to get down to it, there was a Supreme Court.
So that's okay, because I've got 3 chickens.
Yeah,
I could torture them.
Yeah, in the United States, there was a case in the 90s from South Florida involving Haitian immigrants where they used, chicken sacrifice in the context of voodoo rituals and stuff. And so in given our legal framework, the Supreme Court, they're weighing First Amendment religion rights of these groups against local animal cruelty laws. And in that particular case, the Supreme Court sided with the religious rights.
No, I think they should have. Don't you? Don't you think they should have sided with the religious rights?
I don't know. I've raised chickens.
I have too, and that's why I think that they definitely should have sided.
I have to go a different direction from you there.
No, well, because these chickens, they torture me. Why can't I torture them every once in a while?
Right. No, hey, I get where you're
coming from.
But I always tell these, if you've raised chickens.
I have 3 chickens. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, they can actually be affectionate.
They can certainly be demanding.
Right. And but the thing is not that they need to be affectionate on our terms, right? To be respect worthy.
I have a chicken that has trained me to, whenever it comes to the back door and starts throwing itself against the glass, I will go out and give it bird seed.
Oh, well, that's very charming. Yeah. No, our chickens tended to have to be locked up because we had a golden retriever at the time, and she was the biggest hazard to the chickens. They were under protective custody.
Yeah.
Because of that.
I've also seen chickens torture one another. Very cruelly.
The expression henpecking isn't just an expression.
Yeah,
they do that to the new ones. Yeah, no, they're not nice. But I don't think they're. I don't think animals' moral status depends on whether they're nice or not.
But don't you have to have universal law? Like, if I can get a charge with animal cruelty, shouldn't a chicken also be able to be charged with animal cruelty?
Well, it should seem to go both ways,
Because
and
my daughter used to call one of the chickens a murderer, because there were some chicks that we raised, sort of well, there was two instances. One, we brought chicks in, put them under a lamp, and kind of got them up to a point where they could be put out in the yard. And the other time, one of the chickens, had eggs and hatched eggs and chickens. And both times the chicks were murdered by other chickens, by a particular one chicken.
Yeah. Hey, it's not. There's a lot of stuff that ain't pretty in the animal world.
Right. And it was our fault both times, kind of, because we kind of knew
Yeah.
it could happen, but we didn't set up conditions where that couldn't happen. We thought we had, but it didn't. The chickens got into the little space we had put the chicks aside in. But so, like, my daughter, when she was young, hated one of the chickens, thought that, I think it was Ruby or something, was a murderous thug, and that kind of thing. And then the other chicken was a rapist.
Right. Well, I mean, obviously these are like anthropocentric projections, but and there's my favorite animal growing up, bottlenose dolphins. It turns out to be pretty well documented now that they're brutal rapists. I mean, there's a lot of terrible stuff that goes on, but
they should be put in jail.
Well,
by your accounting, it's that they are going to have rights equal rights in front of the law. We should jail the bottlenose dolphins. All right, I'll let you respond now to my silliness.
We'll set up sea jails. Wow, didn't imagine this conversation going in this direction, but that's okay. I guess I would say backing up.
Yeah, right.
I would say that what's significant there is that we're even, in a sense, having the discussion that there's a concept. If 100 years ago, it would simply be discussion of property. The animal rights, pets, horses, chicken, etc., could only really enter into the sort of public consciousness and legal framework and so on as property. And the fact that that's changing, that there is a recognition that there's some value there, that's sentient beings, but maybe that even extends farther than sentient beings, that there's a sense of intrinsic value. And I think there's a kind of nascent awakening to that, just like there have been nascent awakenings about other sort of pushings of the envelope in terms of inclusion, having to do with slavery, and I don't just mean American slavery, but I mean slavery in general. And if you go back even further, the dawn of the axial age, probably one of the original egalitarian notions that starts to define I don't want to say modernity, because it's way before modernity. I'm talking like 500 BC or so, the dawn of the axial age, which is a prohibition on human sacrifice that starts to develop, during that period across cultures, interestingly, across Eastern and Western cultures. But anyway, a more recent evolution of, you could say, moral consciousness, or an enlarging of the capacity, or the capaciousness of our moral consciousness, I think extends to non-human animals, and also perhaps ultimately to something like an environmental notion of Gaia in some respect. But to me, if you stepping back from it, what I think is the significant development is that it's possible to extend egalitarianism. And I mean that very broadly at this point. I don't mean that you can automatically just weigh up a chicken and say, okay, the chicken's completely to be considered the same as a child. I think that would be madness at this point. But where I think we are is that there's a notion that there is value there that's not just reducible to human terms. And in that Judeo-Christian tradition, the usual way of looking, now there are countercurrents in this. There's a notion of stewardship of the earth and all that kind of stuff. But really, I think it's the prevailing notion is that the earth presents resources to us. Animals are resources for our fruitfulness and multiplicitousness and all that kind of stuff. And I think there's sort of a potential turning from those sorts of notions. And I think it's all of this is hastened by climate emergency.
Well, let's talk about.
We got to do business in a different way. We've got to start. Perhaps there's a different way of understanding. And I actually think extending in this direction beyond humanism, you could say transhumanist direction, perhaps, if you want to get fancy about it, that to me is in the truest tradition of the left. That's what's actually interesting and shocking and edgy. And by the way, people shouldn't be afraid of transhumanism as if it's always just some futuristic robotic notion, because transhumanism has been around for a long time. Christianity is a transhumanism.
So you're saying that right, but you're saying that the environment, let's say the entirety of the biosphere, should be considered as a legal subject.
Well, I mean, this is complicated, but I think in general that's the direction to head. So I take inspiration from things like Spain granting, we talked about this before, granting great apes rights. I take inspiration from what Timothy Morton calls hyperobjects, being in some limited respects and interesting sort of emerging respects being granted rights. So for example, in New Zealand.
You know what? I just want to interject and say the last person I ended up suggesting that we should arrest animals to was Timothy Morton.
Oh, okay.
When I had him on, we talked about how monkeys need to be held to higher standards.
Well, perhaps, perhaps. But anyway, in New Zealand, they've designated mountains as having personhood, legal personhood and rights, kind of corresponding to certain ways that the indigenous peoples there have understood them, and using some of that language. And so I think these developments are, to me, those are the kind of cutting edge of morality sorts of developments. And I think they're a promising area for the left to remain being left and to embrace. And I think they're the kinds of things that are probably necessary under climate emergency.
So my possession of my own body as my own property is the foundation of my kind of bourgeois subjecthood, right? That's my primary first right.
Right. You're an individual, and that's pretty
and
much.
I have control of over myself and my own body as my own property.
Yeah, right. Unless you do something to forfeit that and so on. Yeah.
Right. Right. I mean, I can commit a crime
like being a criminal, being convicted of a crime, for example.
Yeah. Right. So one thing that we pointed out already was that we don't really hold that standard to animals the same way we would to one another, that an animal may not be able to lose its sovereignty or its right to its own property and it may not have the same rights to begin with, but it also isn't judged.
That's not, I wouldn't get too, I mean, these are good questions, right? And important things to think about, but I wouldn't get too hung up on like chickens having rights and the vote next.
Well, of course you wouldn't, because those are the very kinds of questions you would want to avoid, because they point out a little bit of a problem in your thinking. But let me, because they seem absurd on their face, right? It seems counterintuitive on its face to suggest that we would lock up a dolphin. But I want to move aside from that and say, all right, but what about the ecosphere as being given personhood and rights? Well, who then could be held in violation of the ecosphere?
Well, look,
how do we define the ecosphere?
These are probably clumsy first takes, right? Because we're trying to fit an emerging moral sensibility in with contemporary legal and moral frameworks that are very anthropocentric, and it looks stupid and clunky, so I'm actually more interested in what is this emerging sensibility. I think you have some of this in other traditions like Buddhism, for example, where there's a focus on sentient beings, I actually think even Kant, in our own tradition, Kant is interestingly more capacious than the tradition within which he's working, because Kant never or almost never speaks of human beings. He always speaks of rational creatures, which is a bit wider referent than just human beings. It
Right.
could be
I would want to say
something
that
else
that
like that.
that notion of sentience or rationality is the key. That when you can find a rational or sentient subject, that sentient or rational subject, and I would say sentient is probably better, or self-reflective.
Well, yeah, because nobody knows what rationality means.
Right.
So,
Rationality is a pretty high bar.
well, also it's a bar that no one knows what it is. So when you examine it, it dissolves.
I guess so. I suppose. I mean, I would tend to say that that it's conceivable to discover reason. That I would say that you can find, like, Aristotelian logic, and the ability to apply that would count as a kind of rationality or reason. I would.
Well, you can have pretty unreasonable people who are clever logicians.
I've
known a lot of them. I mean, I think personally, I think the only workable notion of rationality is adequation of means to ends. Rationality doesn't tell you what's good or bad to pursue in the first place. It just are you able to adequate means to ends?
I think we can reason our way to recognizing sentience as the foundational good, and therefore we can show that reason is the tool by which we've discovered our first axiom.
Well, I mean, maybe. I mean, sentience is okay. I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, I take it as a provisional. I mean, it's wider, and I take it as a provisional place to direct things at present. I'm not sure it's anybody's. It's a stopping point, really. But I take it. I mean, it's better than the anthropocentrism, the idea that the only creatures whose suffering matters are humans.
Right. But when you get to the level of ecosphere, it's difficult to distinguish or discover how an ecosphere could suffer, and accept through various sufferings experienced by sentient.
Right. Well, because we can only conceive in according to our own, framework. That makes sense.
I wouldn't worry about the protecting the ecological structure and stability of Venus, because there's no life on Venus.
Right? Yeah, and I mean, now you're getting way out there. I mean, I would, I don't know. I mean, is there a Gaia of the solar system or something? I don't know. I'm still getting over Pluto being demoted.
Right. But I mean,
planet,
but,
right?
but
So
Gaia,
I'm not sure.
Gaia is
I think that's actually hard to even fathom right now.
Gaia is an idea of an entity which has a consciousness that's more than the sum of her parts, more than all the life together. But
I wouldn't leap right to consciousness, because that's a bit new agey. Now I know from stuff you've said before that there's kind of a reflexive distrust or skepticism of the notion of Gaia. First of all, just the term, it sounds kind of new agey, sort of hippie, new agey. We're all gonna dance around the maypole and do solstice rituals now. And
I've seen that. I've seen Midsummer. I know what you guys said.
Yeah. So yeah, we're all going to become Midsummer now, and we're gonna. I'm getting ready to jump off a cliff pretty soon here. Sorry, spoiler alert. For people out there. So we're all gonna. There's sort of that set of notions, but I think that what I'm attracted to, first of all, in the Gaian notion is the scientific way of understanding Gaia. So from Lovelock and Lyd Margulis, the biologist, and so on, where you're simply noting the ways in which Earth is a self-regulating system, and it's a system of systems of various kinds. Whether or not those systems have consciousness, that's a separate question. That's another question. And I'll tell you this: no one knows the answer to the question of consciousness. That's sort of the hard problem. That's the issue in philosophy right now, if you had to pick one, perhaps. And nobody has the answers to that one. So are systems of a certain complexity conscious? Who knows? Are we conscious? Who knows? I tend to think we are. But who knows for sure. What attracts me to the Gaia notion is that it wires us in, it ties us into this larger entity, let's say the Earth, which is a system of systems, homeostasis of self-regulating mechanisms of all types, from chemical processes regulating the amount of oxygen to pH, acidic levels of the ocean, stuff like that. So across a whole range, we can see that the Earth regulates itself in various ways and has for a very, very long time. Well, I mean, always. And life and the Earth itself are in a certain type of balance that's worthy of, I think, scientific appreciation, moral appreciation, aesthetic appreciation, and even, I never like the word spiritual, but sort of whatever it is that's beyond all that stuff, levels of appreciation. So what I'm attracted to with the Gaian notion is that I think it works on both those high levels of scientific sort of understanding, consonant with research. There are all kinds of respectable scientists who can do research in this area, who can tell you interesting scientific stuff about the processes and of self-regulation of Earth and its various systems. But it also, I think, works on some of the lower levels too, in terms of a conception of, I guess it would start with the concept of seeing ourselves as more a part of the Earth. I mean, it sounds a little cliched, but that's one of those things I think that's easier said than done, is seeing ourselves as actually part of Earth, part of Gaia, whatever you want to call it, rather than as something over and against it, which I think our Judeo-Christian religious traditions tend to push us in this conception of seeing ourselves as this sort of on the model of dualism, as these sort of ectoplasmic creatures who are over and against the material world.
Uh-huh.
And I think Marxism has, Marxism kind of straddles that a little bit, but that's a different topic, I suppose.
Well, okay. So what I was going to ask is, if you just have the self-regulating pattern as your judge, as the way you judge the subjectivity of Gaia, or the whether or not Gaia contains a good that should inform our worldview, I still would want to know, would the self-regulating systems on Jupiter or Venus, which also exist, be of equal value to the ones on Earth, or are we really most concerned about life, and
I think,
thereby consciousness?
like, I guess I would say, I mean, I think these are actually really good questions to ask, because I think that, on one level, on the philosophical level of logic and being consistent, I would have to say, well, yes, Jupiter counts too. Jupiter matters, Jupiter's life matters too. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not so sure about Neptune, but that
Or
might
Venus,
be
I said. I didn't mention Neptune.
That may be just a prejudice, and we've already
everyone knows Neptune's right out. No one wants anything to do
right
with
out,
Neptune.
and we've even written Pluto out, which may be an egregious harm
Right.
that we've done. So, but no, I guess I think that I don't think that gesturing toward a sort of non-anthropocentric conception commits us to Jupiter just yet. I'm not sure we can even get there yet. I think that something like a commitment to the biosphere, et cetera, is probably a digestible next stage.
Life, then. Biological life is what we're talking about.
Where what Gaia does is it essentially ultimately transforms one's conception of the Earth as a living system. So the sort of punchline of the Gaian view of the world is that the Earth is, in some sense, itself a living organism.
Right.
Now, whether it, but I think that doesn't entail anthropomorphizing it, right? It's an organism.
Yeah.
With all these systems. And so now one thing that's hard to get your mind around, if we even can, with this sort of notion, is that ultimately our moral concerns probably are wrapped up within an anthropocentric framework. So it's an open question whether we can actually get away from that. I'm not sure we can ever, any more than we can get away from certain ways in which epistemologically we construct our perception through space and time. We just kind of do that. We're wired that way. And so the concern, the notion of Gaia and so on, the idea that, oh, we ought to do what Gaia wants, that's all new agey stuff. And I would agree, I would stand with you on being skeptical of that. I think that's
Mm.
sort of a category mistake, because make no mistake, I mean, when people say, when environmentalists say things like we're destroying the earth, that's not correct. The earth is not, we're not destroying the earth. The earth is going to be just fine. What we're doing is destroying ourselves.
Right. And other
You
life
know?
forms on the earth.
Yeah, we're taking down a lot of other life forms with us,
Mhm.
but we're not destroying the earth. I mean, I suppose we could, if there were some sort of giant weapon that we could shoot in the core of the earth and blow the
Uh,
whole thing to
like
bits.
something like the Death Star.
Yeah, we might have that conversation. But at the present level of technology, even nuclear explosions and stuff like that, it's not the earth that's going to be, the earth will recover and bounce back from our whatever we can do to it.
And the
at present
biosphere will
technology.
too, right? You think
Yeah,
the
I think so.
biosphere?
I think so. Yeah, I think so. We might end up with the republic of roaches and grass for a while, but it'll grow back, and nature's incredibly resilient. And so really, the conversation we're having about climate and climate emergencies and stuff, that's about us and adjacent species, right? That we're kind of taken down with us too.
Have you
But
read the Kurt Vonnegut book Galapagos?
no, I have not.
Okay, I'm almost tempted to go grab it and hold it up, but I won't.
Okay.
Galapagos, it's the story of the future of humanity after nuclear war.
Hmm.
And the only characters who survive the nuclear war are characters who are on the Galapagos Islands when the nuclear war happens. And what happened, and it's told from the perspective of a ghost. So the ghost is the narrator. And it's been a long time since I read it, but the main point of it was that the problem that humanity had was that they were filled up with ideas, and that everything got better for humanity when all of civilization was wiped out and they became much smaller brained creatures that just dealt with fishing, like flightless penguins, fleshy flightless penguins on the Galapagos Islands, swimming around, eating fish, reproducing, not building anything, not having ideas, not trying to go anywhere.
That sounds like that neo-primitivism of what's his name, Zerzan.
Yeah,
Yeah,
only
it
it's
sort of
Kurt
sounds like that.
Vonnegut's bitter satire.
Right.
Um, but that was the idea was, the biggest problem facing humanity was its ideas. And it seems to me that there's something nihilistic about that, and that what we want to hold on to is the development of consciousness.
Well, see, I agree. I totally agree with you, and I think we can explore that Zerzan stuff, but I think that takes you out of any recognizably left political project for sure,
Right.
because you're doing something else at that point. And you might want to do that other thing, whatever, but it takes you out of that. If you want, see, what I take inspiration in are, and what I give a couple examples of permaculture, and also this notion of refugia, sacred groves, and the like. And so one of the things I like about permaculture, and there obviously there's a lot to be said about permaculture, but permaculture can be thought of in terms of organic farming, almost agricultural practices. It's sort of the art and science of juxtaposing elements. So instead of spraying bug spray on your tomatoes, you find out through research, through lore, through whatever mechanism, you find out what you can plant by the tomatoes that will take away the pests that you're dealing with. When I lived on a farm, very at its most basic, you can imagine a permaculture principle was we had horses in a pasture, and if you harrow the horse manure, which means you just drive a tractor with a chain attached to it over the manure to spread it out, you don't kill the grass, because grass, if it's a big clump of manure, the grass dies underneath the manure. If you spread the manure out, then it magically becomes fertilizer just by the simple act of being spread out. And so it generates this virtuous cycle where the horses poop on the grass, it gets spread out, and then the grass grows in better, and they eat the grass, and you keep going. It's the art of juxtaposition in some respects, permaculture, in terms of farming and forestry. There are elaborate planned forest gardens that use permaculture principles, where you plant one thing next to another thing that needs shade or sun or draws certain pests away and invites other things. So anyway, there's all that, but one of the things that I think is a hallmark of permaculture is that a couple things. One is that it's not anti-scientific. It's not some new agey thing where we're resorting to spiritualism in that old time sense of praying for the crops to do a certain thing or holding seances in the garden or something like that. You're using scientific principles. Permaculture is absolutely hospitable to scientific research and the latest research. People who farm according to permaculture principles are absolutely ravenous for the latest knowledge or ideas from wherever, but not just lab sorts of university produced scientific knowledge. Many times permaculture practitioners of permaculture have found that lore and in Western culture, things that used to be done but had been forgotten in terms of various plants, various farming practices, and so on, but also things that indigenous people have been doing for a long time that were regarded as perhaps came to be regarded as superstitious or unfounded or just part of their religious practices and so on, actually are quite efficacious in terms of fecundity and productivity of the land. And so in permaculture, I think you have principles that kind of, in a way, put one in a greater level of harmony with one's surroundings, with other living things, and with sustaining what you need to grow for human and other animal life. But it's not hostile to science, but it's also not hostile to indigenous knowledge. It's not hostile to lore within our own Western traditions, and so it's very inviting and capacious in terms of the sources of knowledge, the kind of epistemological base that it can bring in. And so, in terms of sacred groves and refugiums, same kind of multi-level justification. So the idea, and this is from the work of this ecological anthropologist, Debal Deb, which I found just really, really suggestive. He talks about the history and actually it turns out that they are essentially a cultural universal, east, west, and everywhere. This notion of sacred groves going by various names, where essentially perhaps forests or areas in a forest. Or elsewhere. Could be a mountain, could be all kinds of different places. But classically, an area in the forest that was designated for religious reasons to be off limits for hunting and agriculture and that sort of thing. And so what some of these researchers have found is that these sacred groves actually served their refugia, just Latin for refuges. They served this purpose of preserving species and biological diversity over the millennia, where they would have been plowed over were it not for these religious beliefs, pagan beliefs, and so on, that these were sacred places that shouldn't be encroached upon. So you have a really, to me, very fascinating and exciting convergence of indigenous knowledge, lore, spiritual practices, but also scientific understanding that renders the whole thing plausible to our modern sensibilities.
What stopped other animals from basically massively altering and changing the balance in these refuges, these sacred lands? Why
What do
was
you mean,
it?
like, what stopped an elephant from charging through and screwing it up?
Yeah, I mean, because it seemed to me that the idea of ecological balance is one in which, we assume that all the other animals are sort of harmoniously living together and they don't eat too much and strip away the vegetation that they need to survive, or they don't alter or destroy their own habitat, but they often really do.
Sure. I mean,
Yeah.
animals can be assholes too, for sure.
Well, I know they can be assholes, but they can also be destructive.
Yeah.
But
And I'm
so
sure some of that has happened, and I'm sure there are probably sacred groves out there that have been trodden upon or ruined by depredations of certain species. I'm sure that's happened.
I guess my real question is this: does a permaculture approach to production, say, allow for there to be development and
Well,
expansion
it does. See,
of
that's,
human
and I'm
power?
glad. Yeah, it does. See, I'm glad you mentioned that too, because the other thing that I think the example of sacred groves and refugia and so on, along with permaculture, illustrates is that it isn't just sort of I don't know, a passive nature worship or something. There's an important role for human intervention according to sound principles of our understanding and consciousness. It's not just kind of this passive awe at everything and not touching anything. There is a role for intervention and to use that old, I guess, Christian notion of stewardship and the like. So yeah, I think the answer to that is for sure yes. So there is definitely a place for people to do this, and there
But
are people doing it. It's not just pie in the sky. There are a lot of people practicing permaculture. Some of my former farmer neighbors were doing some really exciting, interesting permaculture experiments.
could an approach to could a permaculture approach to food production feed everyone who's on the planet currently?
Well, that's what one hopes. Yeah. Yep. And that's the hope. And because also, one thing with permaculture too is that, and you'd have to talk to someone who's more of an expert in agriculture and farming, but I'd want one who actually knows about this specifically to address this. Um, but one thing about permaculture is that it can often, the ideal of permaculture is that you kind of it's actually the best thing for lazy farmers, right? Because you're not out there applying pesticides and all, and that's a lot of work. You're spraying and and all the plowing and but the ideal of permaculture is that the goal is to be lazy, like you kind of set it in motion and let it go. That's the idea behind forest gardens and the like. That you kind of, with you tinker, you help, you tuck something in here, you pull something out here, maybe you introduce some new thing judiciously here, but you're able ultimately to sit back, and the fecundity sort of takes over and is greater than what you had done before, especially in the long term, because we face crises. Everyone talks about climate, and there used to be a lot of talk about peak oil until a few years ago and stuff like that. But it could be that soil degeneration is and what we're doing to soil and so on in the long run might actually be a more dangerous issue for us than some of these other things that we've been worrying about. So I think you also have to place things in terms of the long run, because you can exhaust soil and we can keep refertilizing and so on, but there are limits to this, and it's kind of scary to contemplate some of the soil erosion and soil depletion issues that are going on globally right now. But I think permaculture, in terms of productivity, I would say that you have to think of it, you'd have to measure it in terms of the long term and some of the coming crises in agriculture of traditional chemical agriculture that are probably on the horizon for us.
Well, listen, David, my wife is just coming in. We got to wrap it up here, but
Okay.
I want to say that we will be putting you to the test by allowing people who are part of our Zero Books Club to talk to you directly and ask you questions about your book in the next week. Would you be available?
Yeah, sure.
And I think that this has been a great experiment to have these regular conversations. They haven't been quite as regular as I had hoped, and that was my fault. But I look forward to seeing you again and putting you up in front of the chorus of Zero Books patrons
That's
soon.
great. I'll look forward to it.
And as skeptical as I've been, I of course share your goal of finding a more egalitarian way forward and a more ecological way forward for society. And I want to point out that it seems to me that for permaculture to really take hold, we would have to get beyond capitalism, because capitalism's propensity for growth would work against a permaculture approach to production.
Yeah, no, I think degrowth, I mean, this gets us into a whole new area, but I think degrowth is a central topic of conversation. Absolutely. Yeah.
All right. So we'll talk about that next time, and I'll be only one of many voices you hear.
Cool.
And we'll try to do that next weekend. Say, would that work for
Yeah,
you?
yeah, that's probably good. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to end the broadcast now.